This week we are studying Chapter 3, The Nuts and Bolts of Classical Conditioning, and I had Section 2, which started on page 87. 87 started with the auto-shaping and pigeons. This involves sign tracking. Sign tracking was first researched in auto-shaping, or a form of sign tracking in which a key light that is paired with food elicits a pecking response from the pigeons. It became a popular method of studying classical conditioning. The first study with auto-shaping was conducted by Brown and Jerkins in 1968, where they had to get a pigeon to hit a disc on the wall to get food. To get the pigeons to peck the disc, they would light it up for a couple seconds, and then they would have the food drop in the hole. After these two situations became paired, the bird started to peck the key every time it lit up. What is interesting is the pecking has no relation to getting the food, but the birds associated the two together and pecked because they were hungry when they saw the light. When it comes to auto-shaping, it normally takes 40 repetitive times to create the relationship between a conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. This response in Pavlovian and creates a response where the birds cannot peck the symbol for food. The chapter next talks about operant conditioning in rats. Rats, just like pigeons and other animals, will sign track, but rats will also take part in goal tracking. Goal tracking is the movement towards the site where the positive unconditioned stimulus will be delivered during the presentation of the conditioned stimulus. That signals the unconditioned stimulus. This means during conditioned stimulus, the rat will go towards the food cup where the reward is provided more and more often. Other ways of saying this could be conditioned food cup entry or magazine approach. Conditioned food cup entry and magazine approach are defined as a method of studying classical conditioning in which the conditioned stimulus is associated with a food pellet. The conditioned stimulus comes from a listed approach to the food cup where the pellet will be delivered. In this approach, they use very short conditioned stimulus, normally 10 to 30 seconds, and it takes about 30 trials to create a response. Rats can respond like this outside of the conditioned stimulus as well too. The book then begins to talk about taste aversion. Taste aversion is when the mind develops a resistance towards a certain food. In similar terms, eating certain types of foods cause a bad reaction. This is a form of classical conditioning when the body uses a natural instinct as a means of protection. This is also called a survival mechanism. It warns the body if the type of food, like a berry or a harmful mushroom, is bad for you. Taste aversion is special when it comes to conditioning because the response can be learned after one trial, making it a unique, specialized form of learning. The author, Mark E. Booten, believes that taste aversion gives great insight into classical learning. Taste aversion explains a lot about how animals learn about food also. If an animal likes the taste of something and does not get sick from it, they will most likely eat it again, over and over again, and have the same species around them eat it too. But if one animal in the group has a bad experience with a food, they will most likely never eat it again. And the same goes for humans. The chapter then talks about strength conditioning. The first factor talked about in this is time. Delayed time is important because the conditions, the first factor talks about is time. Animals are sensitive to time and how much time passes between conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus. Time is also important because the conditioned stimulus normally occurs before the unconditioned stimulus. This happens all the time except in delayed conditioning. Delayed conditioning is a classical condition procedure in which the conditioned stimulus commences on its own and then terminates the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. This type of conditioning is very sensitive to time, though. Another time-based conditioning is trace conditioning. Trace conditioning is the type of classical conditioning in which unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus are presented separately with interval of time in between. This difference from classical delayed conditioning, in which there is a delay, but the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus overlap for time. Trace is the time between the conditioned and unconditioned stimulus, and the longer trace time, the less effective the conditioning is because the animals will most likely forget the conditioned stimulus and they won't be able to tell the difference between trace time and break between trials. Break between trials are also called intertrial intervals. The next way to arrange conditioning is simultaneous conditioning. And as you would suspect, both the conditioned and unconditioned stimulus occur at the same time. This type of conditioning is known for creating weak connections. The final type of classical conditioning is backwards conditioning. This is defined as a behavior conditioning method in which unconditioned stimulus is presented before the natural stimulus. This is most likely effective method of conditioning because it doesn't allow for a clear association between the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus. This method isn't as effective as classical conditioning, but still can produce responses. Research shows that conditioning works better when the trials are separated in time. These are called spaced trials, rather than if the trials are back to back to back, which is called matched trials. A theory to why this is because spaced trials create more of a rehearsal feel. Finally, this section talks about novelty of classical conditioning. Finally, this talks about novelty of the conditioned and unconditioned stimulus. This section begins by talking about Linnet ambitions, meaning that conditioning works better when both the conditioned and unconditioned stimulus are new to the animal getting conditioned. When someone is aware of the unconditioned stimulus before the conditioning, it can slow down the effects of conditioning, as well as make it less effective, and researchers call this unconditioned stimulus pre-exposure effect. With this, the more the animal is predisposed to the unconditioned stimulus, the less effective the conditioning will be.